My beloved child. Someone looked your soulmate directly in the eyes and told them to stay away from you. Not to slow things down. Not to think carefully. To stay away. And for a moment, your soulmate actually listened. That is the part you were never supposed to know. Because shortly before their behavior toward you began to feel different, a private conversation took place, one where your name became the center of attention. The person speaking sounded convincing. They claimed they knew something about you, something your soulmate needed to understand before getting any closer. But there was one problem: the story they told was incomplete. One important detail had been left out, and that missing detail changed everything. Your soulmate walked away from that conversation carrying questions they had never carried before. Suddenly, little things about you were being examined differently. Your silence. Your patience. The way you sometimes pulled back instead of explaining yourself. What had once seemed thoughtful now looked suspicious through the lens of somebody else's words. But your soulmate couldn't shake one uncomfortable feeling. If the warning was really true, why didn't it match the person they had actually come to know? That question refused to disappear. Instead of confronting you immediately, your soulmate started paying closer attention. They remembered conversations the other person knew nothing about. They remembered moments when you could have chosen the easier response but didn't. They remembered something especially important, a moment when nobody was watching, when there was absolutely nothing for you to gain, yet you still showed a side of yourself that completely contradicted the warning. And that was when doubt shifted direction. Your soulmate was no longer wondering, "What if I've been wrong about you?" Now they were beginning to wonder, "What if I've been wrong about the person who warned me?" Don't skip, because this is where the story quietly turns. Your soulmate began going back through the details of that private conversation. Certain phrases suddenly sounded rehearsed. Certain accusations were strangely vague. And whenever your soulmate had asked for a specific example, the person had redirected the conversation instead of answering clearly. Then one small contradiction surfaced. It seemed insignificant at first, but it exposed a timeline that simply did not make sense. Your soulmate noticed it immediately, and once they noticed it, they couldn't unsee it. So they did something the person who gave the warning never expected: they checked the story for themselves. Quietly. Carefully. Without telling you and without revealing what they were looking for. What they discovered didn't just weaken the warning, it completely changed its meaning. A piece of information had been presented as though it proved something negative about you, when in reality, the full context showed almost the opposite. Your soulmate felt their stomach drop as the pieces connected. They realized their recent distance may have been influenced by somebody else's interpretation rather than anything you had actually done. But the biggest revelation was still ahead, because one question remained unanswered: why would someone deliberately leave out the exact detail that could have cleared your name from the beginning? Your soulmate needed that answer. And when they finally asked the person directly, there was a pause, just a little too long to ignore. Then came a confession your soulmate never expected. The warning had not begun because of something you had done recently. It had begun because of something that happened long before your soulmate ever knew there was a story behind your name, and the identity of the person who originally started it was about to change everything. What your soulmate heard next made every earlier conversation feel completely different. The person who had originally planted the doubt was not someone who truly knew your heart, your intentions, or even the full story. They knew fragments. Old fragments. Pieces passed from one conversation to another until assumptions had slowly started sounding like facts. And here was the part your soulmate couldn't ignore. The original story had begun during a time when you were already dealing with something privately. You had made a choice that someone misunderstood, and instead of asking you why, that person created their own explanation. Months later, the explanation traveled farther than the truth ever did. Your soulmate suddenly understood why the warning had always felt strangely disconnected from the person standing in front of them. But something else surfaced during that conversation. One detail had been intentionally removed before the story reached your soulmate. And when they asked why, the answer was simple: because I thought knowing that part would make you defend them. That sentence changed the entire atmosphere. Your soulmate went quiet. Because now this wasn't merely about whether someone liked you or disliked you. It was about someone deciding which version of your story your soulmate was allowed to hear. And that realization hit harder than the warning itself. Stay till the end, because what happened next revealed where your soulmate's heart truly stood. Instead of becoming angry, they asked one question: what exactly was left out? The answer came reluctantly. The situation used against you had happened when you were trying to protect someone else's privacy. You had remained silent because explaining yourself would have required exposing something that wasn't yours to reveal. Your silence had made you look responsible for something you couldn't properly defend yourself against. Suddenly, your soulmate remembered every time you had refused to speak badly about people who disappointed you. They remembered how you sometimes said less when saying more could hurt someone. The behavior they had briefly considered suspicious now carried another possibility entirely: perhaps your silence had never been evidence against your character. Perhaps it was evidence of it. And once that thought entered their mind, another memory returned, something you had said casually weeks earlier that now made perfect sense. But your soulmate still wasn't satisfied. They wanted the truth without anyone else's interpretation attached to it, so they quietly reached out to someone who had actually been there when the original situation happened. They expected another complicated story. Instead, they received one clear piece of information that stopped them cold. The person confirmed that you had been given an opportunity to explain everything years ago, and you chose not to because doing so would have embarrassed someone you cared about. You accepted being misunderstood rather than exposing them. Your soulmate sat with that realization longer than anyone knew. Suddenly, the warning to stay away from you looked completely different. The very event being used to question your character may have revealed one of its strongest qualities. But don't assume the mystery ends there. Because your soulmate asked the witness one final question: if that's what really happened, who turned the story against them? There was hesitation on the other end. Then a name was mentioned. Your soulmate recognized it instantly. And what made that name so shocking wasn't simply that this person knew you, it was that they had recently spoken to your soulmate as if they knew nothing about the warning at all. The name changed the entire direction of what your soulmate thought they understood. This wasn't a distant acquaintance repeating something they had accidentally heard. It was someone who had been close enough to the story to know exactly which details mattered, and which details could be removed to make you appear completely different. Your soulmate replayed their most recent conversation with this person and remembered something that suddenly felt impossible to dismiss. When your name had come up, they had acted surprised. Almost too surprised. They had asked careful questions while pretending to know very little, even though they had apparently been connected to the original misunderstanding from the beginning. Your soulmate didn't confront them immediately. Instead, they listened. They wanted to understand what this person was trying to accomplish. And within days, another conversation happened. Your name came up again. This time your soulmate deliberately mentioned one accurate detail from the original situation. The reaction was instant, a pause, a change in tone, then an attempt to move the conversation somewhere else. Your soulmate finally knew they weren't imagining it. Someone had been controlling the story. But here is where everything became more personal. Your soulmate asked directly, "Why didn't you ever tell me the whole thing?" For several seconds, there was no answer. Then the explanation finally came out. This person believed that if your soulmate understood why you had remained silent all those years ago, they would become even more emotionally connected to you. They had watched the bond between you grow and convinced themselves they were protecting your soulmate from getting too involved. But protection had slowly crossed into interference. Instead of allowing your soulmate to judge you through their own experiences, they had handed them a carefully edited version of your past. And your soulmate did not appreciate discovering that someone else had been making emotional decisions on their behalf. Something huge was waiting beneath that realization. Your soulmate admitted that the warning had affected them, but it had never completely changed what they felt about you. In fact, the distance had created the opposite effect. Every day they tried to detach, they found themselves remembering another reason the warning didn't fit. Every attempt to forget you forced them to examine why you mattered so much in the first place. Then came the moment nobody involved had predicted. Your soulmate asked to see whatever proof had originally been used to support the warning. Messages. Dates. Anything concrete. What they received contained one overlooked detail, a timestamp connected to the original event. Your soulmate compared it with what the witness had already told them, and suddenly the final contradiction became visible. Part of the story supposedly involving you had happened before you were even aware of the situation being discussed. That meant at least one major claim could not possibly have happened the way it had been described. Your soulmate stared at that detail, realizing how close they had come to judging you through a story that collapsed the moment someone checked its timeline. But instead of immediately reaching out to you, they made one unexpected decision. They wanted to know exactly how far the misinformation had traveled, and whether anyone else had been quietly influencing the way they saw you. So they contacted one more person, someone nobody had questioned yet. That conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. But before it ended, your soulmate heard a sentence that revealed this story was never really about your past. It was about what someone feared might happen between you and your soulmate in the future. That single sentence exposed the motive your soulmate had been searching for. The warning had grown stronger only after people around them noticed that their feelings for you were becoming serious. Before that, your past had barely been mentioned. Nobody seemed urgently concerned. Nobody was telling them to create distance. But once your soulmate started speaking about you differently, once they began imagining what a real future with you might look like, the old story suddenly resurfaced. That timing mattered. Your soulmate asked the person on the phone what had changed, and the answer was surprisingly simple. Someone had become afraid that if your relationship moved forward, your soulmate's priorities would change too. They might spend less time seeking other people's approval. They might begin making important choices independently. The warning, your soulmate realized, wasn't entirely about who you were. It was partly about who your soulmate was becoming around you. And that realization forced them to examine something even deeper. Had their connection with you actually been pulling them away from themselves, or helping them become more honest about what they wanted? The answer came through memories nobody else could manipulate. Your soulmate remembered how conversations with you had made them question old habits, not because you demanded change, but because they felt safe enough to admit what wasn't working anymore. They remembered that you never asked them to abandon people they loved. You never demanded that they choose you over everyone else. In fact, several times, you had encouraged patience when walking away would have been easier. Those memories mattered because they belonged only to the two of you. No rumor could rewrite them. No outsider could explain them away. And now your soulmate understood why the warning had initially felt powerful but never felt completely true. It appealed to fear while their actual experiences with you kept pointing somewhere else. Don't skip this moment, because this was when your soulmate stopped investigating you and started investigating their own reaction. Why had they allowed someone else's certainty to become louder than everything they personally knew? That question hurt, but it also clarified what needed to happen next. Your soulmate made a decision that evening. No more second-hand stories. No more interpreting your silence through someone else's assumptions. If there was something they needed to know about you, they wanted to hear it from you. But before contacting you, they returned to the person who had delivered the original warning and said something that completely shifted the balance. I know what was left out. The response wasn't denial. It was silence. Then came an admission. They confessed that they had been told the complete version before warning your soulmate, including the reason you had stayed quiet, but they believed the missing context would make the warning less convincing. Your soulmate finally understood that this wasn't an innocent misunderstanding anymore. Someone had knowingly presented only the pieces that supported the conclusion they wanted. Yet instead of exploding, your soulmate asked one final question: what were you afraid would happen if I stayed close to them? The answer came softly, almost reluctantly, and it revealed a truth about your soulmate's future that nobody had expected them to admit. The answer was quieter than your soulmate expected, but far more revealing. I was afraid you would choose a life I couldn't influence anymore. For a moment, your soulmate said nothing. That confession changed the warning completely. What had been presented as concern about you was actually tangled with someone else's fear of losing their place in your soulmate's decisions. Suddenly, so many strange details made sense: the selective information, the exaggerated certainty, the pressure to create distance before asking you a single question. Your soulmate realized that getting closer to you had awakened something they had been avoiding for years: the desire to make important choices without needing everyone else's permission. You hadn't demanded that independence. You had simply entered their life at a moment when they were finally ready for it. And that frightened someone who had grown comfortable being consulted about everything. But your soulmate wasn't celebrating this discovery. They were thinking about you. About the distance you may have noticed. About conversations that became shorter without explanation. About how confusing their hesitation may have seemed when you didn't even know there was an invisible argument happening around your name. That realization brought an emotion your soulmate couldn't ignore: regret. Not because they had listened to someone they trusted. Anyone might listen when a serious warning comes from a familiar voice, but because they had allowed that warning to affect how they treated you before giving you the opportunity to speak. Stay till the end, because this is where their next decision became deeply personal. Your soulmate opened the conversation they had been avoiding and began typing a message to you. They wrote several lines, deleted them, started again, then stopped. I need to explain something, felt too vague. Someone told me something about you, felt too cold. Nothing seemed capable of carrying the weight of what they had discovered. Eventually, they put the phone down. They didn't want their first honest conversation after all this confusion to happen through carefully edited sentences on a screen. They wanted you to hear their voice. More importantly, they wanted to hear yours. But before making that call, your soulmate decided there was one thing they needed to verify, the last piece of the original story that still hadn't been explained. That final check uncovered something nobody had mentioned before. The person you had protected years ago, the person whose privacy you had refused to expose, had eventually tried to correct the misunderstanding themselves. They had spoken up. They had explained that you weren't responsible for what people believed. But somehow, that correction never traveled as far as the original story. Your soulmate sat there stunned by the unfair simplicity of it. The rumor had moved quickly because it was interesting, the truth had moved slowly because it wasn't. And now they possessed something they hadn't had when this began, the complete timeline. The warning had fallen apart piece by piece. Yet one question remained, and this one could only be answered by you. Your soulmate wanted to know why, after being misunderstood for so long, you had never tried harder to clear your own name. They finally reached for their phone again. This time they didn't type anything. They found your contact, stared at it for several seconds, and just before making the call, another message appeared on their screen, from the very person whose privacy you had protected all those years ago. The timing of that message felt almost impossible. Your soulmate had not contacted this person directly, yet somehow they had learned that the old story was being questioned again. The message was short: before you decide anything about them, you deserve to know what they never told anyone. Your soulmate read it twice. Then came another message, followed by details that finally filled the last empty spaces in the timeline. Years ago, you had been offered more than one opportunity to defend yourself. You could have corrected people's assumptions immediately. You could have shown exactly who was responsible for the misunderstanding. But doing that would have exposed a private situation belonging to someone who was already struggling with the consequences of their own choices. So you accepted the uncomfortable silence. Not because you had something to hide, but because you believed another person's vulnerable moment wasn't yours to reveal. Your soulmate suddenly understood something deeper. The warning had taken one of your most difficult decisions and interpreted it without knowing the reason behind it. Yet there was still one line in the message that made them stop completely: they never asked me to defend them. Not even once. That sentence stayed with your soulmate. They thought about how easily you could have used the truth to make yourself look better. You could have pointed fingers. You could have turned the entire situation into proof that you had been treated unfairly. Instead, you apparently carried the misunderstanding without demanding that anyone repair your reputation. And now your soulmate finally understood why you hadn't spent your time desperately convincing them of who you were. You had allowed your actions in the present to speak for themselves. But that realization also made their regret sharper. They remembered moments when you probably sensed something had changed between you, yet you didn't pressure them for answers. You gave them room. What they once interpreted as emotional distance now looked more like restraint. Something huge is waiting for you here, because your soulmate's feelings didn't simply return to where they had been before the warning. They became clearer. For the first time, they could separate what they personally knew about you from what other people wanted them to believe. And once those two things were separated, the difference was impossible to ignore. Your soulmate finally made the call. When you answered, there was a brief silence, not awkward, but heavy with everything neither of you had said. They didn't begin by accusing anyone. They didn't repeat every rumor. They simply told you, "I heard something about your past, and I should have asked you about it sooner." Then they waited. Your response surprised them. You didn't rush to defend yourself. You didn't demand names. You asked one question: did what you heard change the way you see me? Your soulmate had prepared explanations, but not for that. After another pause, they admitted the truth, for a little while, yes. But then I started checking what I was told. And that was when the conversation shifted. Because you quietly said something your soulmate hadn't heard from any witness, message, or second-hand account. You revealed that you had known for some time that someone was warning people about you. You even had an idea who it was. But the reason you never confronted them had nothing to do with fear, and when your soulmate heard why you had remained silent again, they realized there was still one final layer of this story nobody had uncovered. Your soulmate wasn't prepared for what you said next. You explained that confronting the person would have been easy, but proving them wrong had never been your priority. You already knew how the story had been twisted. You knew which details were missing. What you didn't know was whether someone close to you would eventually trust their own experience enough to question it. So you made a difficult choice. You refused to compete with the rumor. You kept showing up as yourself and allowed time to expose whatever words couldn't. Your soulmate went silent because suddenly they understood why you had never chased them during the period when they became distant. You weren't indifferent. You had noticed everything. The shorter conversations. The hesitation. The subtle change in their energy. But instead of demanding reassurance, you gave them space to decide what they believed. Then you said something that stayed with them. I wanted you to choose based on what you've actually known of me, not because I gave the better argument. That sentence landed harder than any defense could have. For the first time, your soulmate told you exactly how close they had come to stepping away. They admitted that the warning had frightened them because it came from someone they trusted. But they also admitted something else. Every time they tried to accept that person's version of you, their own memories contradicted it. They remembered your consistency when nobody was watching. They remembered conversations where you listened instead of controlling the outcome. They remembered how you treated people when there was nothing to gain. Slowly, your soulmate realized that the strongest evidence had been sitting in front of them all along, not in screenshots, old stories, or somebody else's opinion, but in the pattern of your behavior. And then they told you about the confession. The person who warned them had admitted they were afraid your soulmate would build a life they could no longer influence. You didn't respond with satisfaction. You simply asked, "And what do you want now?" That question changed everything, because suddenly there was no rumor left to hide behind. The decision belonged entirely to your soulmate. They took a breath before answering. They said they wanted to stop allowing other people to define connections they hadn't personally lived. They wanted to rebuild the trust their hesitation had disturbed. But before they could say anything more, you asked one final question. Are you coming back because the warning was false, or because you finally know what you feel? Your soulmate wasn't expecting that distinction. One answer would have been about proving somebody else wrong. The other would require them to finally tell you the truth about themselves. There was a long silence. Then your soulmate admitted that even during the distance, their feelings had never disappeared. If anything, trying to stay away had shown them how deeply the connection had already affected them. But there was something they still hadn't told you, something they had decided before making this call. They had already taken one concrete step to remove the outside interference from their future decisions. And when they finally revealed what they had done, you realized this conversation wasn't simply repairing what had happened. It was about to change what happened next. What your soulmate had done was surprisingly simple, yet it carried more weight than any dramatic promise could have. Before calling you, they had gone back to the person who warned them and established a boundary they had avoided setting for years. They didn't end the relationship or create unnecessary conflict. They simply made one thing unmistakably clear: you can care about me, but you cannot decide who I trust for me. For someone who had spent years allowing familiar voices to influence important choices, saying those words wasn't easy. But your soulmate finally understood that protecting a relationship didn't mean blindly defending you either. It meant refusing to let anyone replace facts with assumptions. They would listen when genuine concerns appeared, but they would ask questions, check context, and speak directly to you before reaching conclusions. And there was another detail. The person who had warned them didn't argue this time. Instead, they admitted that they had noticed something changing in your soulmate long before the warning began. Your presence wasn't making them weaker. It was making them harder to control. That admission stayed in the air between you. Your soulmate told you they had started recognizing how often they sought approval before making choices that belonged to them. Who they spent time with. Which opportunities they considered. Even what kind of future they allowed themselves to imagine. Knowing you had quietly challenged that pattern without ever demanding anything from them. You had asked questions nobody else asked. What do you actually want? Does this choice make sense to you? Are you doing this because it's right for you, or because everyone expects it? Those questions had seemed ordinary at the time. Now your soulmate realized why someone else had found your influence uncomfortable. You weren't taking control of their decisions. You were encouraging them to take control back. And that distinction changed the entire story. The warning that nearly separated you had accidentally exposed the exact reason your connection mattered so much. But there was still something your soulmate needed to say. They knew discovering the truth didn't automatically erase the distance they had created. Trust couldn't simply be switched back on because the mystery had finally been solved. So your soulmate made no grand promise. Instead, they offered something more believable: honesty from this point forward. If they heard something concerning, they would bring it to you. If they felt uncertain, they would say so. And if the two of you eventually discovered that your paths weren't right for each other, that decision would come from what actually happened between you, not from somebody else's edited version of your story. You respected that. In fact, your calm response seemed to confirm something your soulmate had been realizing throughout the entire investigation: you weren't asking to be idealized. You were asking to be known accurately. Then, just as the conversation seemed ready to settle into something quieter, your soulmate revealed one last detail. The person who had warned them had eventually apologized, but during that apology, they mentioned something neither of you had heard before. Someone else had encouraged them to bring up your past at exactly the moment your soulmate started getting closer to you. And when your soulmate told you who that person was, you immediately recognized the connection. Because this wasn't someone from your distant past. This was someone who had been watching the two of you much more recently.